So thank you, Pastor Steve, for the introduction. Tonight I'm going to speak about Johannes Oecolampadius. I chose him for several reasons. One, his name is fun to say. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but that's the way I'm saying it. Oecolampadius. Opening remarks. I know there are several people in our church who teach, either at home, teach homeschool, or teach in school, or teach here at church, Sunday school. Why do you like being a teacher? What made you want to teach? Any of you that are teachers? Actually, question. It's your one chance to ask a question. Anyone have a reason they like to teach?
Would you like to share things that you know?
Share things that you know.
It's an opportunity to teach the Word of God.
Very nice. Very nice. Yeah, for me, the reason I enjoy teaching is, y'all probably don't realize this about me, but I like to talk. Standing up in front of people all day long and talking and get paid for it? Amazing. An actual reason I like to teach is to see the light come on. When you're presenting about something, teaching about something, can you all see? Am I blocking? When you're teaching about something and you see the light come on, that gives me a lot of joy. And so that's one of the reasons I like to teach. This is relevant to the presentation tonight, but I must have a warning first. Pastor Steve asked me to do this in April, so I've had time to prepare. I really enjoyed preparing for this. Pastor Steve mentioned really enjoying preparing for things and how sometimes that makes it longer because he really enjoyed it. I've had since April. I really enjoyed it. If you mind me going over 4 hours, blame Pastor Steve. Okay?
I appreciate that.
Thank you again for the introduction. So what's in a name? Johannes Oecolampadius. He was born as Johannes Hausschein in 1482 in Weinsberg, Germany. He was born to Johannes and Anna Hausschein, and his name, Hausschein, in German means house lamp. I showed the light bulb a minute ago and the light coming on. Johannes Oecolampadius, another reason I chose him. His name meant house lamp. He Latinized his name from Hausschein. He went to Greek oiko or oikos, I think is house, and then lampadius, lamp, house lamp, and then he put it into Latin, hence Oecolampadius. Some of his colleagues, I'm not going to have time, I'd like to have time, but I don't, to go through all of these. But Wolfgang Capito, Martin Butzer, Ulrich Zwingli, Martin Luther. Calling Martin Luther a colleague is, they were sort of colleagues, sort of. Philip Melanchthon, again, he was kind of on Luther's side, but I'll talk a little bit more about him in a few minutes. Erasmus was a colleague. And then John Calvin wasn't really a colleague, in air quotes. They never met each other, as far as we know. But many people think that Calvin was highly influenced by Oecolampadius. There are some people that call Oecolampadius a spiritual father to Calvin in some ways. And then He wrote 21 commentaries on the Bible. And again, I'm not going to have time to go through all of those. One of the things about my study for Oecolampadius and trying to find out about him, there's actually very little written in English. As I dug more and more into it, I found more things. There are several PhD dissertations written about him, but books, very, very few in English. There's a lot in German. Pastor Matt said I should learn German, and there's a German for Dummies book in the library. I'm too dumb. It didn't help. And in Latin. I also don't know Latin. And there's a lot of stuff written by him and about him in Latin. It's just not been translated into English. Weinsberg und Heilbronn. So I mentioned he was born in Weinsberg, Germany. Born into a family of some means. His father was possibly or probably a merchant. His mother was known as a pious woman. And the red dot there, I know this, most of you can't really see it much, but there's a red dot there. That is Weinsberg. It's a pretty small town even today, about 13,000, 15,000 people maybe. His father wanted him to follow in his work, be a merchant. It's a good way to make money. His mother wanted him to have a good education. Who do you reckon won out on that? He was sent to Latin school in Heilbronn, which is here, slightly bigger town nearby. And he proved himself brilliant while he was in Latin school. They started school. You guys love school? All the young people in school just love going to school? Clark loves it. They started Latin studies at 5 a.m. in the morning. 5 a.m. would be in the morning, wouldn't it? But in the winter, they gave them a break, and they started at 6. The schoolmaster where he went to school was a humanist, and he trained people in the humanist revival, what was known as the humanist revival. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Maybe he went to Bologna University. His father, the story goes that his father wanted him to study law and sent him to law school in Bologna, Italy. Bologna. Bologna. However, the person in charge of the money, the person who had the purse, absconded with the funds. And he was like, I don't care about him going to law school, and I've got all this bag of money, I'm going to leave. So he took off with the money. He thus was not able to continue his studies. So he went to Heidelberg University. He entered Heidelberg University, or University of Heidelberg, in 1499 at the age of 17 to study theology. He earned his BA in 1501. I'm not great at math, but 1501 minus 1499, it's pretty quick to earn your BA. He slowed down a little bit and earned his MA in 1503. The time between 1501 and 1503 was one of the times that the plague, the Black Death, swept through Europe, and the whole school, Heidelberg University, had to leave, uproot, and move to another city to finish or continue their studies. So during that time from 1501 to 1503, he earned a master's, but he also had to deal with the Black Death. He was influenced by humanist Jakob Wimpfeling. I'm trying to use the German pronunciation there. And so this is where I wanted to speak a little bit more about humanism. Pastor Matt, I think it was in the men's study, talked about humanism. He mentioned it just a little bit. And he mentioned the Latin term ad fontes, which was a return to just a return to the languages, to Greek, to Hebrew, and to learn that. Oecolampadius put a great deal of effort into that. Possibly returned to the university around 1508. Some people say he did, some people say he didn't. Here's a picture of the church in Weinsberg. I think it's a really pretty picture. You can't tell much probably from a distance, but there's bunches and bunches of grapevines there. And I found out Weinsberg is an area known for grape growing even today. And it was back then. The time from 1503 to 1512 is kind of obscure. There's a lot of debate about what happened during that time with Johannes, Oecolampadius. Again, I just like saying his name. There's some debate about it. There's not a lot, no. What I tell you, if you look it up and say, that's not right, well, look at some other authors and you'll find out. Maybe it is. Again, back to Bologna. Maybe during that time he went to Bologna, or maybe he never did. There's debate among authors. Some, as I said earlier, say that he went right after he finished school in Heilbronn and then went to Heidelberg after that. Some people say he went to Heidelberg, got his BA and his MA, and then after that went to Bologna to study law. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me why he would have done that. Doing it the other way around seems to make a little bit more sense, but we don't know. At some point, he was ordained to preach in the Catholic Church, and he started preaching in this church, Weinsberg Church, in 1510. While he was there, he published his first work in 1512 on the Passion of the Lord. Even back at that early time, it was evident that he wasn't like a lot of the other priests. And remember, when did Reformation happen? The day we celebrated Reformation Day? What year did it happen? Anybody remember? Other than the two pastors?
The Reformation?
Yes, sir.
1517?
1517, exactly. But in 1512, he published a writing on the Passion of the Lord. He then went to Tübingen University. He resigned from the pastorate position and entered Tübingen University in 1513. Am I going too fast or too slow? I'm wanting to go faster because they said we couldn't eat until. So, at Tübingen, he met Philip Melanchthon. Philip Melanchthon was 15 years his junior, but they met while he was at Tübingen, and they became friends. They were actually quite close. He also met Johann Recklin. Am I saying that correctly? I'm saying it correctly, Recklin. And Johann Recklin was known to be one of the finest Hebraists of his day, also knew Greek. And so he studied quite a bit under Rechlin. He returned to Heidelberg University in 1514 or 1515. There he met Wolfgang Capito. You saw his name on the list of colleagues a few minutes ago. I'll say something more about him in a little bit. While he was at Heidelberg that time, he began writing his own Greek grammar. That grammar was used for around 100 years. It was well thought of and used by a lot of people for around 100 years. In 1515, he traveled to Basel for the first time to work with Erasmus on his Greek New Testament. I mentioned Jakob Wimfeling, I'm probably saying his name wrong, a few minutes ago. He recommended to Erasmus, hey, you should get this young guy down here, Oecolampadius. He was about 30-ish. You should get him to help you. He's pretty good at Hebrew. So he went to Basel and helped Erasmus edit citations and footnotes and things like that for the Old Testament in Erasmus's Greek New Testament. He also wrote not a foreword to it, but a kind of like a summary or of it. Very soon after getting to Basel, he entered Basel University in 1515. He received the Baccalaureus Biblicus and Baccalaureus Centenarius. Sorry if I'm really hosing those Latin names. A little bit later on, in 1516, he received the Baccalaureus Formatus. He traveled back and forth between Basel and Weinsberg. He would preach in Weinsberg, basically kind of an itinerant priest almost, and then study in Basel, back and forth. And this is, I didn't measure it on the map, but it's got to be 100, 150 miles. It's not, they're not really close. And there were no motorways or, the Autobahn didn't exist at the time. But he traveled back and forth every week between the two for a couple years, 1515, 1516. And then he received his Licentius Theologiae in 1516. He received a doctorate from the University of Basel on November 27th, 1518. So I mentioned Luther. There's a lot of commonality between he and Luther. They were both monks, we'll see in just a minute. Both of them studied law. They both received their doctorate. A lot of commonality like that. He became cathedral preacher at Augsburg by the end of the year. This is a view of Augsburg Cathedral today. And then in 1520, he left the pastorate again. He had left earlier when he was in Weinsberg. He left the pastorate at Augsburg and he entered Altomünster Monastery, something else he and Luther had in common. He spent some time in a monastery just like Luther did. He only stayed in the monastery about 2 years though, a little less than 2 years. He left in January 1522 and he hid in Ehrenberg Castle. If you got to hide in a castle somewhere, that's a pretty sweet place to be. Might have looked a little bit different back then, but he hid in the castle for less than a year. He was afraid of his life, just like Luther was during these times. And so he was there. Then in November, he returned to Basel again. He started as proofreader for Cratander's Press in Basel. I didn't mention that earlier, but that Cratander's Press was one of the finest publishers of the day. Basel, his press published several of Luther's works, was the press that published Erasmus's New Testament and several other things. So it was a very well-known publisher, and Oecolampadius worked as a proofreader there in Basel for a very short time. At some point, he became vicar of St. Martin's Church, and there's a picture of St. Martin's. In December of 1522, he contacted Zwingli for the first time that we know of, and started a relationship with Zwingli. The Basel Council opposed Pope Hadrian's rule to basically do away with all Lutheran preachers. At the time, you were either Catholic or Lutheran. You were considered Catholic or Lutheran. Although Oecolampadius was not a Lutheran, you were one or the other, as far as the Catholic Church was concerned. But the council didn't like that ban, so they appointed him as a theology teacher at the University of Basel. Kind of stick it to the Pope, I guess. He lectured on Isaiah, and then he became chief priest at St. Martin's and published the Isaiah commentary. In 1524, he offered a communion cup to believers. His lectures were open to the public, the lectures from Basel University, and he drew hundreds and hundreds of people to his lectures. He was very popular. He agreed with Zwingli about the Eucharist. 1525, he produced the earliest German Protestant liturgy. He refused to say Mass for the dead, so he was moving further and further away from the Catholic influence. He preached only evangelical sermons, and he received the theological chair at University of Basel. I'm going to speak more of that in just a moment or two. He published De Genuina Verborum Domini in Strasbourg. I mentioned that Cratander's Press was very well known as a publisher, but at this time, a few years later, there was great concern about publishing this in Basel, so they had to go somewhere else to publish it. And then he also published 66 sermons by Chrysostom. How do you say that?
Chrysostom or Chrysostom?
Chrysostom. In addition to all of the commentaries that he wrote several things and studied quite a bit the church fathers and got a lot of his ideas from the church fathers. So this is just an example of one of the works of them. Moving on to 1526, he published Anti-Syngramma. A year or two earlier, I don't remember who it was, and I'm not looking at my notes, because I'm trying to make this quick. Someone had published Syngrama, and he published anti-Syngrama against that. Also in 1526, the congregation sang. They broke into singing one Sunday, and at first the council went, "You're not supposed to do that." And then they went, "Okay, you can do that." So they approved it. And we've been talking in Sunday school about the interrelationship between government and the church. And there was a lot of that happening at this time, where there was a lot of pressure from people in the town to move away from the council having total control over the church. And so there was a lot of back and forth between the council and other people in town. But they started easing up on some of the restrictions and letting Oecolampadius have his way a little bit more. The Baden Disputation happened, and the first proposal of agendae to the council. It was the earliest Protestant church ordinance, including church discipline. Calvin is known for his work around church discipline and just his church ordinance. He got a lot of it from Oecolampadius. Hopefully I'll speak about that more in a minute or two. In 1527, the Basel Council allowed people to choose their own church and whether they would take communion. I mentioned earlier that he started offering the communion cup to everyone. 1528, the Bern Disputation happened. This picture, you can't read it, of course, but it's him and two other professors from Basel University. And it's supposedly 1527, 1528. They're sitting in a, kind of looks almost like they're sitting in a pub or something, but supposedly it was a meeting house that they would sit in and just have a chat, have a drink. And his mother died in 1528, and he married Wibrandus Rosenblatt. I mentioned Wolfgang Capito earlier. He had developed a close friendship with Wolfgang Capito. Capito told him, "You ought to get married. You really should get married." And by this time he was 40-ish. He was in his early 40s. And the clergy, former clergy, they were starting to get married. We've seen that with some of the other reformers. Capito said, you ought to get married. And I don't know if it was Capito that said, "Hey, this Wibrandus Rosenblatt, she's recently divorced." She was 21, I think. So there was about a 20-something year age difference between them. He married Wibrandus. They had children. Son Eusebius was born. The small iconoclastic tumult happened. People started tearing down icons and such in the church, just a little bit. And the council said, well, we're going to remove all of these icons and things from 4 churches. But in 1529, the actual Basel iconoclast revolt happened. There was basically a riot. Oecolampadius restructured the University of Basel. So he had been made the chair of theology. In 1529, he restructured the university and applied a lot of that humanist teaching, where the ad fontes returned to the languages. And he made Greek and Hebrew, he kind of raised them up in importance And so that was some big change that he made in 1529 at the University of Basel. Basel entered the Federation of Reformed Swiss Cantons. This name that Reformation's done, the constitution of a Reformed church, based on his earlier agenda that I mentioned a few minutes ago. That was accepted by the council, but still not to the same level as what Calvin got Geneva to accept several years later. And then he also became head pastor at Münster. And the biggest thing that some of you might know, at least the pastors, is, and Jordan, maybe a few others, Marburg Colloquy happened in 1529. There was basically the Marburg Colloquy was a very large debate on the Lord's Supper. The body and the wine, the bread and the wine. Luther famously, I did check it out, Pastor Steve. According to what I read, it wasn't at the very beginning, but while he was speaking, he picked up a piece of chalk and wrote across the table, "This is my body." And then he kind of put a tablecloth across it. And so I've got it written right here. Philip, the Landgrave, it was at his house, his castle in Marburg. He was trying to get Luther and Zwingli together to basically, so they would form together and be able to ward off Catholic oppression, and so that there would be a unified front regarding, you've got the Catholic view of the Eucharist here, he wanted a reformed view of the Eucharist here. But Luther he didn't want it. He would have none of it. Also, his daughter Irene was born, and the emperor issued a decree against Anabaptists. 1530, he published dialogue, outlined a plan for lay leaders in church discipline. He died in 1531, so we're almost done. In 1531, he traveled to Ulm, another German city, a little ways away. He and Butzer together traveled to Ulm and essentially restructured the council, did a lot of the same Reformation in Ulm in a very short time, things that he had done in Basel. So he and Butzer together were able to work. The council in Ulm and the people in Ulm were very receptive to it, and so he was able to do a lot there. There was another city as well, and I don't have it down. Daughter Alethea was born. Servetus was exiled from Basel. Servetus was a heretic, and he had actually, Oecolampadius had given him a place to stay. He stayed at Oecolampadius' house for a while. Some people believe that that's one of the reasons that Oecolampadius is not nearly as well known as Luther or Zwingli or some of the other reformers. Some people think it's because Oecolampadius was not as loud, he was not as forceful, he was known to be very kind of meek. Zwingli, not so meek, died in battle on October 11th. Zwingli decided that, I guess he was a theonomist, and he was going to go to war with his troops, and he did so, and he was killed in battle. And then Oecolampadius was offered but refused the leadership of the Zurich church. So he could have moved to Zurich and taken over from Zwingli. He said, no, I don't want to do that. Quite possibly because he knew he was sick, and he died just a little over a month later. He died in November. Date's not certain, but November 23rd. I also saw November 13th. I think 23rd is probably a better day. So an epitaph. Dr. John Oecolampadius, theologian by profession, expert in 3 languages, Greek, Hebrew, Latin. First teacher of evangelical doctrine in this city, true overseer of this church, as in teaching, so also very mighty in sanctity of life, lies concealed beneath this narrow slab. That is a quote in Stalin, his work. This was a German researcher in, I think in the 1800s is when he wrote this. Might have been, I might not have the date exactly. Bibliography. These are the 2 main works that I ended up using. Just Reformer, Basil. You can get these online if you're interested in reading more about Oecolampadius. Diane Poitras is the first one, and then The State of Research of the Basil Reformer by Jeff Fisher. I actually found out today, as I was looking for some final pictures, there are a couple works now in English. There's a book of sermons by Oecolampadius that someone has translated into English. And I found another work, I forget what it was, but being that it was today, it was a little late to go into that. I wish I would have had 6 weeks to present this rather than 20, 30 minutes, whatever it's been. But that is Johannes Oecolampadius. Happy Reformation Day 2024.
Thank you. Amen.
That's it.
Thank you.
Welcome.
That is one of those topics that the more you research, the more you realize my level of study is just not going to fit in 30 minutes. But John did a great job, and thank you, brother, for introducing us to this reformer. I did not know a lot about him beforehand, so our conversations over the last several months has helped me learn more about Oecolampadius. Brother Clark, would you pray for us? Pray for the food.